Has your ability on your instrument plateaued? Do you feel like the more and more you practice, you're kind of wasting your time? Now, most people have figured out that practice is really important if you want to be better at anything. However, researchers are finding out more and more that practice isn't enough. In fact, most of top performers in the world today, whether it's violin or sports or even business, they probably practice differently than you do. Well, today I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. So let's get to it. So today is just a continuation in our series on talent, right? And so we've already talked in previous videos about the myth of talent, right? Now that myth is that some people are just born with an innate ability to just be better at some skills. Maybe they're more sensitive to music, maybe they're smarter so they're better at chess, right? But what we've found is that talent does exist, but what talent is, it's actually a person's ability to actually practice more, to practice longer, and to practice a certain way. Now, of course, the topic of talent has been looked at by researchers from all around the world for a long time, going back to the 60s. They basically found that in order for you to achieve a high level of skill at anything, you need 4 main ingredients. Number 1, of course, is that talent that we talked about. Number 2 is time. You need a lot of time, especially time mastering that craft when you're younger. Number 3 would be a really good environment, right? So especially when you're younger, you need that encouraging environment. You need to be surrounded by the right people. And number 4 is deliberate practice, or just practicing a certain way. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, as I mentioned, people have been studying this phenomenon of talent going back to as early as the 1960s. Now, there was an educational psychologist, his name was Laszlo Polgar, and he believed that prodigies were created, not born. He believed this so strongly that he actually wanted to do an experiment with actual kids. So what he did is he actually put an ad in the paper for a woman to marry him so he could do this experiment. Well, shockingly enough, I suppose, a woman answered his ad. They ended up getting married, and they ended up having 3 daughters. So by the time the first daughter was 4 years old, the experiment officially began. Now, Laszlo had decided that all 3 daughters were going to be chess masters. Okay, so this is a bit of a tall order because, for example, this was the 1960s. So back then, women were not well represented in chess at all. It was a very male-dominated sport. In fact, women were not even allowed to compete in the Chess World Championships. Also, Laszlo was not a great chess player. His wife had never played chess, but he still had this goal because I don't know exactly why, but I think he was really trying to prove a point. Well, long story short, all 3 daughters became chess masters. In fact, the youngest daughter was the youngest person ever to achieve the level of chess grandmaster. She was 15 years old, and she was the youngest person for men or women to achieve that status. So what Laszlo did is he incorporated 2 primary things, in their youth. So number 1, he made sure that they had a lot of time, right? So he started teaching his first daughter by the time she was 4. They spent hours a day practicing. So by the time, they were in their teenage years, they'd already put in the same amount of time that a lot of chess grandmasters have put in, that 10 years, right? It's kind of this 10-year rule. The other thing was that he made sure that they practiced using deliberate practice techniques, right? He really watched the methodology of how they practiced. Now, he wasn't a chess aficionado at all, but what he did, he did the best that he could. So he got every kind of book on chess that he could. He had tons of records of all these different chess masters and teachers and how they played, and they had records of all these different games that occurred around the world. So he did what he could. Now, as far as talent is concerned, because we do know talent does play a part, talent did play a part. All 3 daughters didn't achieve exactly the same success. Some of them were less apt to practice as much. Some of them were less apt to challenge themselves as much intellectually, right? And like we already found out, that's what talent is, right? It's the ability to practice longer, to want to push your mind, push yourself mentally a little bit harder. Now, more recently in the 90s, there was a landmark study that was done by a guy named Anders Ericsson. Now, he went to the Academy of Arts in Berlin, and he actually looked at violinists. And what they did is they had the professors, rate all the violinists in 3 different categories. So there's good, better, and best. And what they wanted to know is, well, why were some violinists better than other violinists? So they looked at everything about their lives, their practice routine, when they practiced, you name it. They even looked at their childhood. Well, unsurprisingly, what they found is that the best violinists spent more time practicing. However, it wasn't like a huge amount in college, but when they looked at their childhood, that's where the big difference was in terms of the amount of practice time. The best violinists, in some respects, actually practiced twice as much as the good violinists when they were really young. So most of, the majority of the practice occurred when they were, teenagers, when they were little and all up to 18 years old. However, the biggest thing that they noticed, besides the additional practice, was really how the best violinists practice. And what they found is that they used the habits of what we call deliberate practice. So let's talk about what deliberate practice actually is. Now, there are 5 primary components to deliberate practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to list them one by one, but I'm going to explain how each one can relate to you personally, assuming that you're trying to learn an instrument. Okay, so number 1 is engaging in an activity specifically for the purposes of improving performance. So what that simply means is, and how it's applicable to you playing your instrument, is that you're finding areas in the music that you want to improve, either because you're not familiar with them or because it improves a particular skill. So what that doesn't mean is that you don't want to spend a lot of time playing through things that you already know, things that you're already good at. You really want to focus in on as small a part as possible, right? Find that little 3-note slur or that one measure or that one phrase. Find that little piece that you're not good at and practice specifically to be good at that little piece. Now, number 2 is finding an activity that challenges you mentally, but it doesn't over-challenge you mentally, right? So if you can imagine 3 tiers, right? So the bottom tier would be playing something that doesn't challenge you at all. It's really easy. It's something that you're good at. Number 2 would be finding something that does challenge you. You're not super good at it, but you can play it repeatedly and you're learning something. Number 3 would be finding something that is just way too hard for you. It's way out of your league, and it just frustrates you because it's just way too hard. So part of your talent, to some extent, is finding that middle tier, finding those parts in the music or that particular skill that is attainable to you. It's difficult to you, it's challenging for you, but you can still do it repeatedly and you can get better at it. That's what we call the learning tier, right? And this kind of skill set is, of course, applicable to many other, vocations, whether it's sports or the arts, music, business, many different things. When I read this particular skill set, of challenging yourself mentally, it reminds me of some of the interviews that I've seen with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It might seem like that's not relatable, but it is actually. So Arnold Schwarzenegger would talk about in some of the interviews about how he would get really frustrated. One of his pet peeves, if you will, was going to the gym and seeing people who would work out. They would just go through the motions, right? So they weren't really focusing on what they were doing. And he was always talking about the mind to muscle connection, which of course is totally applicable to us as musicians, right? The mind to the muscle, knowing exactly what your body is doing. He would talk about putting your mind inside the muscle when you're working out. So he would always make sure to really mentally challenge himself while he was working out and put a great effort into that. And other people would come to the gym and they would just go through the motions, right? They weren't really mentally, actively challenging themselves or really in the moment, in the muscle. They weren't in touch with what their body was doing. And as a result, a lot of these people, they would go to the gym, they go through the motions, they would never achieve their goals. They couldn't get bigger, they couldn't get more defined, they couldn't get to the level that they wanted to. And it's simply because they weren't doing this one particular step, which is you've got to be able to challenge yourself and challenge yourself consistently. Okay, so number 3 is pretty self-explanatory. Make sure that this activity that you choose to improve is something that you can repeat a lot. So kind of going back to what we were talking before, make sure that, if you're trying to improve this skill, you find this one thing that has to do with that skill, and then you repeat this thing and you play it correctly as many times as you can. So whether you're trying to improve a skill or a particular passage in a piece of music, you're trying to play it correctly as many times as you can. Okay, so 4 is feedback is necessary. And this kind of harkens back to the importance of having a good teacher, a good coach, a person who can lead you through the process, right? And that's really important for just a couple of reasons. Number one is that a teacher or coach, they can look at you from the outside, right? You can't really see yourself play. You can't necessarily see what your pinky is doing completely. You can't see that dropped elbow. You can't see you leading with your wrist. You can't see, the tension in your jaw. There's a lot of things you can't necessarily see, because you're you and you're not outside of you. And that's why a teacher can be really helpful in this situation. The other reason is because we as humans tend to be very biased, right? We tend to focus on the positive aspects of what we're doing instead of the negative ones. And a teacher can be a non-biased, party that can tell you, look, you're doing this wrong and you keep on doing it wrong. Let's focus on this one particular thing. And that reminds me, of when I was a kid. I remember the first time I started recording myself, this is in the 80s. So, video cameras weren't around too much, but you could audio record yourself, right? So you got your boom box and you push record and you record on the tape, tape cassette. But when I was doing like an audition or whatever it was, I would record myself to see what I really sounded like. I remember the first time that I did it and I listened to myself, I was like, oh, I sound awful. I can't believe, do I really sound that bad? But the reason why I was surprised is because I didn't realize at the time how powerful your mind is. Your mind can make you hear things that are not there. You're trying to sound perhaps like that recording that you've heard, and you've got that recording in your mind. It tends to kind of gloss over a lot of the inaccuracies, the pitch problems, the articulation problems, the style problems, the rushing, the dragging, all these kinds of things. So it's really important to record yourself, especially if you don't have a teacher, right? So that's my other point about this, is that if you are not in a position where you don't have a teacher or you don't see one in your near future, at the very least, record yourself. Get a video camera and record yourself. That way you can really see what you're doing and you can really hear what you're playing as well. So guys, I hope this video was helpful. I hope that I've shed some a different light, a different way of looking at things as far as your practice is concerned. And there's a lot of things that I could have talked about, but I don't want this video to be super long. So if you have some questions, please put them below, because that gives me, my material for my videos, and I like answering people's questions. So put them below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that alert bell, because I'm creating videos all the time and you'll get notification when I create a new video. So I hope you guys have an awesome week. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And don't forget, happy practicing.